Dogs that know when their owners are coming home, and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals by Rupert Sheldrake. Preface. This is a book of recognition. A recognition that animals have abilities that we have lost. One part of ourselves has forgotten this, another part has known it all along. As a child, like many other children, I was interested in animals and plants. My family kept a great variety of pets. In addition to our dog, Scamp, we had a rabbit, hamsters, pigeons, a jackdaw, a budgerigar, a terrapin, 2 tortoises, several goldfish, tadpoles, and caterpillars that I would rear each spring. My father, Reginald Sheldrake, a pharmacist and amateur microscopist, encouraged my interest and fueled my fascination with the natural world when he showed me how drops of pond water teemed with myriad forms of life and what the scales on butterflies' wings look like. I was especially intrigued by the way that pigeons homed. On Saturday mornings, my father took me to see a great liberation of them at our local railway station in Newark-on-Trent, in the English Midlands. Racing birds from all over Britain were waiting in wicker baskets, arrayed in stacks. At the appointed time, the porters let me help them open the flaps. Out burst hundreds of pigeons in a great commotion of wind and feathers. They flew up into the sky, circled around, and set off in various directions towards their faraway homes. How did they do it, I wondered. No one seemed to know. Their homing ability is still unexplained today. At school, it was a natural choice for me to study biology and other sciences, and I continued my scientific education at Cambridge University, where I studied botany, physiology, chemistry, and biochemistry as an undergraduate, and then took a PhD in biochemistry. But as I proceeded in my education as a biologist, a great gulf began to open up between my own experience of animals and plants and the scientific approach that I was being taught. The mechanistic theory of life, still the dominant orthodoxy, asserts that living organisms are nothing but complex genetically programmed machines. They are supposed to be inanimate, literally soulless. As a general rule, the first step we took when studying living organisms was to kill them or cut them up. I spent many hours of laboratory work in dissection, and then, as my studies proceeded, in vivisection. For example, it was an essential part of my biology curriculum to dissect nerves from the severed legs of frogs and stimulate them electrically to make the muscles twitch. I heard nothing about how pigeons homed. These student exercises were mild compared with my experience as a temporary laboratory technician in the pharmacology department of a multinational pharmaceutical company, where new drugs were developed and tested. I worked there for 6 months between leaving school and going to university when I was aged 17. There were rooms full of rats, guinea pigs, mice, and other animals waiting to be experimented on. At the end of each day, dozens of animals that had survived various tests were gassed and thrown into a bin for incineration. A love of animals had led me to study biology, and this is where it had taken me. Something had gone wrong. I began to wonder what was going on and tried to find out. After my undergraduate studies at Cambridge, I was awarded a Frank Knox Fellowship at Harvard, where I studied philosophy and the history of science in search of a wider perspective. I then returned to Cambridge to begin research in biochemistry. A few years later, I came across a Cambridge-based group of scientists and philosophers called the Epiphany Philosophers, whose members included distinguished philosophers of science, quantum physicists, and visionaries who explored the areas between science, philosophy, and spiritual insight. Within this group, there was a consensus that old-style mechanistic science was too limited, and that quantum physics was pointing the way to a broader vision of nature. I soon became a member of this group and found that beneath the seemingly conventional surface of science, there was a ferment of ideas pointing toward a new understanding of the world. For 10 years, I did research at Cambridge in developmental biology, while continuing to think about the outlines of a more holistic science. I became a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, where I was a director of studies in biochemistry and cell biology. I was elected a research fellow of the Royal Society, and under the auspices of Royal Society, I worked at the University of Malaya on rainforest plants. I later became principal plant physiologist at ICRISET, the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, in Hyderabad, India, helping to improve the growth and yield of crops that are a vital part of the diet of hundreds of millions of people. Building on my experience in biological research and on years of discussions with colleagues, in 1981 I published a book entitled A New Science of Life, in which I outlined a new hypothesis on which a broader kind of biology could be based. I developed this hypothesis of morphic fields further in my 1988 book, The Presence of the Past. In this book, I describe new ways of testing this hypothesis, which I summarize in Appendix C. I have spent over 25 years as a professional scientist, publishing papers in scientific journals and speaking in scientific congresses, and have long been a member of scientific societies such as the Society for Experimental Biology and a fellow of the Zoological Society. I am a great believer in the value of scientific inquiry, but I am more convinced than ever that the mechanistic theory of nature is now too narrow. I have discovered that an increasing number of my scientific colleagues agree, although most are reluctant to say so in public. I have found that the split I experience within myself, the gulf between personal experience of life and the theory that living organisms, including ourselves, are merely soulless automata, is widespread within and outside the scientific community. I have come to realize that this split is not inevitable, and that a more inclusive kind of science is possible as well as cheaper, but it is inevitably controversial. For some scientists, the mechanistic theory of nature is not just a testable hypothesis, but it is more like a religious creed. For others, open-minded inquiry is more important than the defense of long-entrenched dogmas. I have found such scientists a great help in my researches and have received much encouragement and practical support. In 1994, I published a book called 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, in which I explored 7 well-known but little understood phenomena and suggested how inexpensive research could lead to major breakthroughs. One of these experiments concerned the possible telepathic abilities of dogs and cats. In particular, I focused on the ability of some dogs to know when their owners are coming home. Thus, through trying to find ways in which a broader view of life can be developed scientifically, I have come back to pets. It took me a long time to recognize that they are the animals we know best. I knew this as a child. To many people, it is blindingly obvious, but for me it had all the force of a new discovery. I realized that the animals we know best have much to teach us. They can help enlarge our understanding of life. They are not just cute, cuddly, comforting, and fun. For the last 5 years, I have been doing research on the perceptiveness of pets with the help of over 2,000 animal owners and trainers. I have surveyed more than 1,000 randomly chosen pet owners to find out how common various kinds of unexplained behavior are. My associates and I have interviewed hundreds of people with much experience of animals, including dog trainers, search and rescue dog handlers, police dog handlers, blind people with guide dogs, veterinarians, kennel and stable proprietors, horse trainers and riders, farmers, shepherds, zookeepers, pet shop proprietors, reptile breeders, and pet owners. If I had quoted from all of the accounts and interviews that I have been given, this book would have been at least 10 times thicker. In some instances, hundreds of people have told me about very similar patterns of behavior in their pets, like dogs knowing when their owners are coming home. I have had to condense this information, given only a few examples of each kind of perceptive behavior. Although many people have contributed to the overall picture, I can acknowledge only a small minority by name. Without all this help from people, named and unnamed, this book could not have been written. I am indebted to all those who have helped me and to their animals. Introduction. Kate Loffer, a midwife and social worker in Norway, works at odd hours and returns home at unexpected times. But whenever her husband Walter is home, he greets her with a hot cup of freshly brewed tea. What accounts for her husband's uncanny timing? The family dog, Tiki, the terrier. When Tiki rushes to the window and stands on the windowsill, says Walter Loffer, I know that my wife is on her way home. When the telephone rings in the household of a noted professor at the University of California in Berkeley, his wife knows when her husband is on the other end of the line. How? Whiskins, the family silver tabby cat, rushes to the telephone and paws at the receiver. Many times he succeeds in taking it off the hook and makes appreciative meows that are clearly audible to my husband at the other end, she says. If someone else telephones, Whiskins takes no notice. Julia Orr thought her horses had settled happily into their new paddock when she moved from Skirmit, Buckinghamshire, to a farm 9 miles away. But Badger, a 24-year-old Welsh cob, and a 22-year-old Tango were merely biding their time. One night, 6 weeks later, when a storm blew open the gate of the field, they took their chance. At dawn, they were waiting patiently at the gate of Mrs. Orr's old home. They had found their way back on unfamiliar roads and tracks, leaving telltale hoof prints on the shoulder of the road and in flower beds as they went. On October 17, 1989, Teresa Meek of Santa Cruz, California, saw her cat run up to the attic and hide, which she had never done before. She seemed terrified and refused to come down. 3 hours later, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck, devastating the center of Santa Cruz. Dogs that know when their owners are returning home, cats that answer the telephone when a person they are attached to is calling, horses that can find their way home over unfamiliar terrain, cats that anticipate earthquakes. These aspects of animal behavior suggest the existence of forms of perceptiveness that lie beyond the present-day scientific understanding. Through 5 years of extensive research on the unexplained powers of animals, I have come to the conclusion that many of these stories told by pet owners are well-founded. Some animals really do seem to have the powers of perception that go beyond the known senses. There is nothing new about the uncanny abilities of animals. People have noticed them for centuries. Millions of pet owners today have experienced them personally. But at the same time, many people feel that they have to deny these abilities or trivialize them. They are ignored by the institutional science. Pets are the animals we know best, but their most surprising and intriguing behavior is treated as if it is of no real interest. Why should this be so? One reason is a taboo against taking pets seriously. This taboo is not confined to scientists, but is a result of the split attitudes to animals expressed in our society as a whole. During working hours, we commit ourselves to economic progress fueled by science and technology and based on the mechanistic view of life. This view, dating back to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, derives from René Descartes' theory of the universe is a machine. Though the metaphors have changed from the brain as hydraulic machine in Descartes' time to a telephone exchange a generation ago to a computer today, life is still thought of in terms of machinery. Animals and plants are seen as genetically programmed automata, and the exploitation of animals is taken for granted. Meanwhile, back at home, we have our pets. Pets are in a different category from all other animals. Pet keeping is confined to the private or subjective realm. Experiences with pets have to be kept out of the real or objective world. There is a huge gulf between companion animals treated as members of our families and animals in factory farms and research laboratories. Our relationships with our pets are based on different sets of attitudes and I-thou relationships rather than the I-sit approach encouraged by science. I experienced this split myself in a particularly intense way, as is described in the preface of this book. Whether in the laboratory or in the field, scientific investigators typically try to avoid emotional connections with the animals they are investigating. They aspire to a detached objectivity. They would therefore be unlikely to encounter the kinds of behavior that depend on the close attachment between animals and people. In this realm, animal trainers and pet owners are generally far more knowledgeable and experienced than professional researchers on animal behavior, unless they happen to be pet owners themselves. The taboo against taking pets seriously is one reason why the phenomena I discuss in this book have been neglected by institutional science. Another is the taboo against taking psychic, paranormal phenomena seriously. These phenomena are not rare or exceptional. Some are very common. They are called paranormal, meaning beyond the normal. Because they cannot be explained in conventional scientific terms, they do not fit in with the mechanistic theory of nature. Research with pets. The wealth of experience of animals among horse and dog trainers, veterinarians, and pet owners is generally dismissed as anecdotal. This happens so often that I looked up the origin of the word to find out what it means. It comes from the Greek root anekdotos, meaning not published. An anecdote is an unpublished story. Some fields of research, for example, medicine, rely heavily on anecdotes, but when they are published, they literally cease to be anecdotes. They are promoted to the rank of case histories. In the research described in this book, I have used 3 complementary approaches. First, I and my associates have interviewed hundreds of people who are experienced in dealing with animals, including dog trainers, veterinarians, blind people with guide dogs, zookeepers, kennel proprietors, and people who work with horses. I have also appealed through specialist magazines and through the general media for information from pet owners, and have collected over 2,000 accounts of specific kinds of animal behavior that suggest unusual perceptiveness. I have found that many people have had very similar experiences with their animals, and when so many people's accounts point independently to consistent and repeatable patterns, anecdotes are transformed into natural history. At the very least, this is a natural history of what people believe about their animals. Second, I have organized formal surveys in Britain and the United States involving random samples of households in order to quantify the frequency of the various kinds of perceptiveness shown by companion animals. Third, I have explored the question of whether people's beliefs about their animals are well-founded or not by means of experimental investigations. One of my favorite books in biology is The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication by Charles Darwin, first published in 1868. It's full of information that Darwin collected from naturalists, explorers, colonial administrators, missionaries, and others with whom he corresponded all over the world. He studied publications like Poultry Chronicle and the Gooseberry Growers' Register. He grew 54 varieties of gooseberry. He drew upon the experience of cat and rabbit fanciers, horse and dog breeders, beekeepers, farmers, horticulturists, and other people experienced with animals and plants. He joined 2 of the London pigeon clubs, kept all the breeds he could procure, and visited leading fanciers to see their birds. The effects of selective breeding in domesticated animals and plants, observed with such attention by practical men and women, gave Darwin his strongest evidence for the power of selection, an essential ingredient in his theory of evolution by natural selection. Since the time of Darwin, science has increasingly cut itself off from the rich experience of people who are not professional scientists. There are still millions with practical experience of pigeons, dogs, cats, horses, parrots, bees, and other animals, and of apple trees, roses, orchids, and other plants. There are still tens of thousands of amateur naturalists, but scientific research is now almost entirely confined to universities and research institutes and carried out by professionals with PhDs. This exclusivity has seriously impoverished modern biology. Why hasn't this research been done before? The investigation of the unexplained powers of animals that I describe in this book has been facilitated by modern technical devices such as computers and video cameras, but in principle, most of these investigations could have been carried out 100 or more years ago. The fact that they are only now beginning is a tribute to the strength of the taboos against such inquiries. I believe there is much to be gained by ignoring these taboos. I also believe there is much to be gained by following a scientific approach. This is the approach I have followed myself, and which I summarize in this book. But the word scientific can have quite different meanings. All too often it is equated with a narrow-minded dogmatism that seeks to deny or debunk whatever does not fit within the mechanistic view of the world. By contrast, I take scientific to mean a method of open-minded inquiry, paying attention to evidence and testing possible explanations by means of experiment. The path of investigation is more in the spirit of science than the path of denial, and it is certainly more fun. These different scientific attitudes are illustrated by a tale of a horse called Clever Hans, which is usually used to justify the dismissal of seemingly unexplained animal powers. I draw the opposite moral from the story and see it as an example of the need to investigate rather than to deny unexplained phenomena. Sooner or later, anyone who takes an interest in an unexplained power of animals will be told the story of Clever Hans. This story has assumed the role of a cautionary tale for scientists. The Tale of Clever Hans. In Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a horse named Hans who was said to be able to perform mathematical calculations, read German, and spell out German words. He tapped out answers with his hoof. His trainer, Herr von Osten, a former mathematics teacher, was convinced that Hans had mental capacities thought to be confined to human beings. The horse caused a sensation and gave many demonstrations for professors, military officers, and others. Clever Hans' abilities were investigated by Professor C. Stumpf, director of the Psychological Institute at the University of Berlin, and his assistant, Otto Pfingst. They found that the horse could give the correct answers only when the questioner knew the answer himself and when Hans could see the questioner. They concluded that Hans had no mathematical abilities and he could not read German. Instead, he was reading small body movements of the questioner, and these told him when he had tapped with his hoof the right number of times. This tale of clever Hans has been used ever since to justify the dismissal of unexplained abilities of animals, attributing them to subtle cues rather than to any mysterious powers the animal might have. In short, this story has been used to inhibit research, to prevent inquiry rather than to stimulate it. But to draw this moral from the tale of clever Hans does not do justice to the investigations of Stumpf and Fungst. They investigated a controversial claim rather than dismissing it, and they were brave to do so because their conclusions went against the beliefs of many of their colleagues. Clever Hans' abilities were controversial not because they were supposed to involve psychic powers, but rather because they were supposed to show that animals could think. Many scientists, especially Darwinians, were happy to believe that clever Hans really could do arithmetic and understand German. They liked the idea that animals were capable of rational thought because this undermined the conventional belief that the human intellect was unique. They preferred the idea of gradual evolution, of differences of degree rather than differences of kind between humans and non-human animals. Conversely, traditionalists were very skeptical about clever Hans because they thought that higher mental faculties were confined to man. Stumpf and Fungst's findings supported the traditionalists and were unpopular with disappointed Darwinians who expressed fear lest ecclesiastical and reactionary points of view should derive favorable material from the conclusions. Although biologists sometimes talk about the clever Hans effect as if it were a reason for dismissing any unexplained abilities in animals, the effect is quite specific. It depends on body language, which in horses is an important element in their communication with one another, as it is in many other species. If an animal can respond to a human being when that person is out of sight, this is not an example of the clever Hans effect, but requires some other explanation. In the course of research on the unexplained powers of domestic animals, I have found that most animal trainers and pet owners are well aware of the importance of body language, but in any case, many of the phenomena I discuss here, such as the apparent ability of animals to know when their owners are coming home, cannot be explained in terms of the clever Hans effect. An animal cannot read the body language of a person many miles away. 3 kinds of unexplained perceptiveness. In this book, I discuss 3 major categories of unexplained perceptiveness by animals: telepathy, the sense of direction, and premonitions. Telepathy. I start with the ability of some dogs and other animals to know when their owners are coming home. In many cases, an animal's anticipation of a person's return cannot be explained in terms of routine, clues from people at home, or the sound of a familiar car approaching. In videotaped experiments, dogs can still anticipate their owner's return at randomly chosen times, even when the owners are traveling by taxi or some other unfamiliar vehicle. Somehow, people telepathically communicate their intention to return home. Some companion animals also respond telepathically to a variety of other human intentions and react to silent calls and commands. Some know when a particular person is on the telephone. Some react when their owner is in distress or dying in a distant place. I suggest that telepathic communication depends on bonds between people and animals, bonds that are not mere metaphors but actual connections. They are connected through fields I call morphic fields. I introduce these fields in Chapter 1, in which I also discuss the evolution of the bonds between humans and animals. The sense of direction. Homing pigeons can find their way back to their cote over hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain. Migrating European swallows travel thousands of miles to their feeding grounds in Africa, and in the spring return to their native place, even to the very same building where they nested before. Their ability to navigate toward distant destinations is still unexplained and cannot be accounted for in terms of smell or any other known senses, or even a compass sense. Some dogs, cats, horses, and other domesticated animals also have a good sense of direction and find their way home from unfamiliar places many miles away. Animals seem to be drawn toward their desired destination as if by an invisible, elastic band that attaches them to that place. These connections may be explained in terms of morphic fields. Sometimes animals return not to places but to people. Some dog owners who have gone away and left their pets behind are found by the animal in distant places the animal has never been to before. Tracking the person by smell may explain some cases when the distances are short, but in others, the only feasible explanation seems to be an invisible connection between the animal and the people to whom they are bonded. Again, this could be compared to a stretched elastic band, which I attribute to the morphic field linking animal to owner. Premonitions. Some premonitions may be explicable in terms of physical stimuli. Animals that have become disturbed before earthquakes, for example, may be reacting to subtle electrical changes. Dogs that alert their epileptic owners to an impending fit may notice subtle muscular tremors or unusual odors. But other premonitions seem to result from a mysterious foresight that challenges our assumptions about the separation of past, present, and future. Telepathy, the sense of direction, and precognition are examples of what some people call extrasensory perception, or ESP. Others attribute them to a sixth or seventh sense. Others call them paranormal. Still others call them psychic. All these terms point beyond the limits of established science. Extrasensory perception literally means perception beyond or outside the senses. At first sight, the term sixth sense appears to mean the opposite because it implies a perceptiveness within the senses. Although by another kind of sense not yet recognized by science, this conflict vanishes if extrasensory is taken to mean outside the known senses. Neither the term extrasensory perception nor the term sixth sense suggest what these experiments are or how they work. The terms merely tell us what the events are not. They are not explicable in terms of the known senses. All three types of perceptiveness, telepathy, the sense of direction, and premonitions, seem better developed in non-human species than they are in people, but they do occur in the human realm too. Human psychic powers seem more natural, more biological, when they are seen in the light of animal behavior. Much that appears to be paranormal at present looks normal when we expand our notion of normality. Science can advance only by going beyond its current limits. In this book, I hope to show that it is possible to investigate animals' unexplained abilities scientifically in ways that are neither invasive nor cruel. I also suggest a variety of ways in which animal owners and students could make major contributions to this new field of inquiry. We have a great deal to learn from our companion animals. They have much to teach us about animal nature and about our own.